It was supposed to be just another oversight hearing on Capitol Hill. Another day, another round of questions, answers, and partisan posturing. But what unfolded that afternoon would reverberate far beyond the hearing room. What began as a procedural examination of election oversight quickly veered into something else, something deeper, more personal, and ultimately unforgettable. Pam Bondi, a high-profile conservative figure known for her staunch defense of Republican values, had been called to testify. She arrived poised and prepared, expecting tough questions but not expecting to ignite a firestorm. Then it happened. In response to a pointed question from Representative Jasmine Crockett, a rising Democratic voice and one of Congress's most unflinching advocates for equity, Bondi uttered a phrase that instantly shifted the tone of the room. "Maybe you should go back to your village." A statement laced with condescension and racial undertone. The silence that followed was deafening. Even seasoned lawmakers looked stunned. Staffers paused. Reporters froze mid-type. But what came next didn't follow the usual script of outrage and chaos. Jasmine Crockett didn't yell. She didn't storm out. She didn't meet insult with insult. Instead, she responded with something far more powerful: composure, clarity, and a challenge that no one saw coming. Her words left the entire room speechless and set off a wave of public reaction that neither woman could have anticipated. This wasn't just a clash between two political figures. It was a defining moment about race, respect, power, and how. True leadership is revealed not in the heat of attack, but in the precision of a response, and it all started with 7 words. Go back to your village. Stay with us. You're about to witness how one woman transformed a moment of disrespect into a national turning point, and how a single sentence redefined the conversation in Washington. To fully understand the gravity of what happened, we need to go back to the buildup that led to this tense moment on Capitol Hill. The hearing was officially convened to investigate alleged irregularities in local election practices. Pam Bondi had been called as a key witness, largely due to her vocal criticisms of how certain districts, especially urban, heavily black communities, conducted elections. Representative Jasmine Crockett, whose district includes some of those very communities, came prepared. She wasn't there to posture. She was there to challenge assumptions, demand facts, and confront narratives she saw as racially coded and deeply misleading. As Crockett began her questioning, the tension in the room was palpable. Calm but assertive, she asked Bondi to clarify the basis for her claims, specifically why Bondi had characterized voters in predominantly black districts as suspicious or unreliable. Bondi, confident and polished, sidestepped with generalities about voter integrity, security, and so-called patterns she claimed to observe. But Crockett didn't let up. She pressed harder, pointing out that Bondi's language often mirrored long-standing stereotypes used to cast doubt on black political participation. She cited data, historical context, and real examples from her own district, cutting through rhetoric with precision. That's when the shift happened. Visibly rattled by the pressure, Bondi attempted to regain the upper hand, and that's when she delivered the line that changed everything. Maybe you should go back to your village. A phrase loaded with centuries of racial implication. A phrase that evoked more than just disrespect. It evoked dismissal, dehumanization, and a long history of silencing black women in public life. Gasps rippled through the hearing room. Lawmakers exchanged glances. What had started as a policy debate had just taken a very personal and very public turn. And the question on everyone's mind: how would Jasmine Crockett respond? There was a moment of absolute stillness in the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Pam Bondi's words, "Go back to your village," hung in the air like smoke after a spark, the weight of them immediately recognized by everyone present. Representative Jasmine Crockett took a breath. Her face remained composed, but her eyes were sharp, unwavering. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat, and most importantly, She didn't lash out. Instead, she did something few expected, her voice calm even. Crockett leaned into the microphone and began to speak, not with rage, but with purpose. "Miss Bondi," she said, "it's easy to sit here and make assumptions about communities you've never visited, about voters whose lives and realities you've never taken the time to understand." Her words cut through the tension like a blade, not hostile, but firm, informed, and impossible to ignore. Crockett didn't just reject the insult. She reframed the moment entirely. She spoke of her district, not as a place to be condescended to, but as a community rich in culture, history, and resilience. A place where people work hard, raise families, and believe in the democratic process, even when that process has often failed them. She didn't stop there. Then, turning what could have been a moment of pure condemnation into something more powerful, Crockett offered Bondi a challenge. "Would you be willing," she asked, "to come visit my district, to sit down with the very people you've labeled as suspicious, to speak with them, not at them, and see for yourself what democracy looks like in practice?" The hearing room froze. Even those who had expected confrontation didn't anticipate this. Pam Bondi, who had walked in with the usual confidence of a well-seasoned political operative, looked caught off guard, genuinely. There was a pause. Then, softly, she answered. "Yes," she said. "I would be willing to do that." Crockett nodded once, deliberately. "Thank you," she replied. "My office will be in touch to arrange it." And with that, she leaned back in her chair and said the final words of her time. "I yield back." Silence gave way to stunned murmurs. What had just happened wasn't just a clapback. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was something far rarer, a moment of moral clarity. Crockett had met an insult not with fury, but with facts, strength, and an open invitation to dialogue, and that was the moment the internet and the nation took notice. Within hours of the hearing, the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Pam Bondi spread like wildfire. Clips of the moment flooded social media, not with flashy edits or added commentary, but raw and unfiltered. Crockett's calm, composed rebuttal, her challenge, Bondi's stunned acceptance. It was all there, and the internet responded. Pulla Crockett began trending on X, formerly Twitter, with users from across the political spectrum reacting to the unexpected twist, a poised and powerful answer to a racially loaded insult, ending not with outrage, but with an open door. Commentators called it everything from a masterclass in restraint to the most powerful moment on the Hill this year. And it wasn't just partisans cheering from the sidelines. Major news outlets picked up the story almost immediately. On CNN, the headline read, "A turning point on Capitol Hill, Crockett transforms insult into invitation." Over on Fox News, the framing was more cautious, but even they had to acknowledge the gravity of the moment. Heated exchange leads to surprising reconciliation attempt. And on MSNBC, political analyst Michael Barnes offered perhaps the most telling insight. What we saw today wasn't just another political clash, it was a moment of leadership. Representative Crockett didn't just defend herself, she redefined the rules of engagement in political discourse. But the response wasn't confined to the media. Conservative groups that had previously stood behind Pam Bondi began distancing themselves from her remark. Some issued formal statements emphasizing their commitment to respectful debate. One organization, where Bondi had been scheduled to speak the following month, quietly removed her from the lineup. Pressure mounted, and by the next day, Bondi released a public apology, more detailed, more serious, and more carefully worded than many expected. My comment to Representative Crockett was inappropriate and wrong. It did not reflect my values or intentions. I am sincerely sorry for using language that carried racial implications, regardless of what I meant to convey. I have accepted the Congresswoman's invitation and look forward to that opportunity for dialogue and understanding. The hearing had been meant to discuss election oversight. Instead, it had turned into a national referendum on how we talk to each other, how we disagree, how we confront prejudice, and how we respond when someone crosses a line. Pam Bondi had entered the room as a practiced conservative firebrand. She left it as the center of a national controversy, and Jasmine Crockett, she left the room with her head held high and her reputation transformed. She hadn't just won a moment, she'd reshaped the narrative entirely. 6 weeks after that now infamous hearing, the cameras were off, but the stakes were still high. Pam Bondi followed through on her public commitment, stepping far outside her comfort zone to visit the very district she had once characterized with suspicion. This wasn't a press stunt, no media crews, no grandstanding, just 2 women and a quiet but weighty attempt to bridge a very real divide. The visit was deliberately low-key. Over 2 days, Bondi met with community leaders, election workers, local activists, and voters. Ordinary people with extraordinary patience, people who had heard her words, who had felt the sting of them, and yet still opened their doors. Jasmine Crockett didn't parade Bondi around or force a public reckoning. Instead, she made space for questions, for discomfort, for listening. Behind closed doors, conversations unfolded that were sometimes tense, often emotional, but always grounded. In one principle, dignity. Election officials walked Bondi through the processes she had once questioned from afar. Ballot tracking, vote tabulation, security measures, all laid bare with clarity and transparency. Local organizers spoke about the impact of rhetoric that casts doubt on majority black districts, about the fatigue of always having to defend the legitimacy of their democracy, and yet they spoke not with hostility, but with resolve. Bondi listened. She asked questions, and for much of the visit, she said very little. But by the end, both women released a rare bipartisan joint statement. Today's conversations were challenging but productive. We discussed election procedures, community concerns, and the importance of evidence-based claims about our democratic processes. While we maintained different perspectives on many policy issues, we found common ground in our commitment to respectful dialogue and our belief that all American communities deserve to be engaged with dignity. For Crockett, the visit wasn't about vindication. It was about education and transformation. And for Bondi, it marked a humbling reminder of what happens when words leave the echo chamber and land in real communities. There were no fireworks, no applause. But something more powerful happened, the beginning of understanding. And in today's political climate, that alone made headlines. What began as a single moment in a crowded hearing room soon grew into something much larger. For Representative Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation with Pam Bondi wasn't just a viral clip. It became a defining inflection point in her political journey. The day after the hearing, Crockett's office was flooded. Messages of support, interview requests, invitations to speak, not just from her district in Texas, but from across the country. Pundits praised her response, not for its outrage, but for its restraint, not just for its strength, but for its grace. Veteran political correspondent Michael Barnes called it a masterclass in how to respond to racial provocation with precision, composure, and a path forward. Even conservative voices, usually quick to dismiss Democratic rising stars, acknowledged her skill. L. Sanderson, writing in the National Review, noted, "Whatever your politics, Crockett's response demonstrated political intelligence of the highest order. She stood her ground and offered a door instead of a wall." In Washington, senior Democratic leaders took notice. Crockett was no longer just a backbench representative. She had become a symbol of what principled leadership could look like in polarized times. Months later, when a major voting rights bill was introduced in Congress, it was Crockett, still relatively new to Capitol Hill, who was chosen as one of its lead sponsors. It was a signal, a recognition. She wasn't just speaking for her district anymore. She had earned a broader platform, but her influence wasn't limited to politics. At universities, her exchange with Bondi was added to leadership curricula. Business schools studied it as a model of conflict resolution under pressure. Diversity trainers cited it as a case study, how to address a racial microaggression without fueling division. Crockett didn't just correct a falsehood, she connected it to history, to lived experience, and then turned it into a teachable moment. Dr. Marcus Williams, author of Beyond Call-Out Culture, put it this way in an NPR interview. Crockett's power came from her balance. She didn't perform outrage. She laid out facts. She extended dignity. She did what most people in power forget how to do. She taught in real time. Her approach struck a chord, not because it was loud, but because it was clear. And back home in Dallas, she was celebrated not for clapping back, but for standing tall. A local community college launched a scholarship in her name for students pursuing public service, and the scholarship wasn't about partisanship, it was about values. Jasmine Crockett showed us how to turn disrespect into dialogue, said Reverend James Thompson at the launch event. She didn't just win in sobriety argument, she led by example. For many, the term pulling a Crockett entered the modern lexicon. It meant standing firm with facts, responding to insult with clarity, and never missing the chance to build a bridge, even while holding the line. Her rise wasn't about ambition, it was about authenticity. And in a time when performative politics so often drowns out substance, Jasmine Crockett reminded the nation what real leadership sounds like. The ripple effects of that confrontation between Pam Bondi and Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't end with headlines or hashtags. It seeded something deeper, a shift in how political discourse, racial sensitivity, and public accountability were discussed across the country. In the weeks following the hearing, major news outlets began adjusting how they covered allegations of voter fraud. Anchors now demanded specifics. Editors pushed for substantiation. Vague, racially tinged claims about election irregularities, once repeated without scrutiny, were now met with sharp, evidence-based questions. Even state legislatures responded. Several introduced new requirements mandating that any allegation of voting misconduct must be accompanied by actual documented proof before launching official investigations. Why? Because Crockett had exposed something critical, that these so-called concerns about elections in minority-heavy districts weren't rooted in fact, but in fear, prejudice, and political convenience. Election law expert Professor Diane Rodriguez summarized it best. That moment didn't just respond to an insult. It reframed the entire conversation around election integrity. It forced the nation to confront a pattern of suspicion aimed disproportionately at communities of color and demand evidence, not insinuation. But perhaps the most unexpected legacy of all. Bondi herself changed course. 6 weeks after the hearing, as promised, she visited Crockett's district. No cameras. No press. Just meetings with local election officials, community leaders, and voters, the very people she had implicitly maligned. Afterward, both women released a rare joint statement. While we maintained different views on policy, we found common ground in the belief that all communities deserve to be treated with dignity and truth. 1 year later, they sat side by side on a panel about civil discourse and politics. Bondi, the same figure who once uttered, "Go back to your village," publicly acknowledged her mistake. Representative Crockett could have responded with pure condemnation. She didn't. She challenged me, and then gave me a chance to learn. That kind of leadership is rare. Crockett, in turn, made clear, offering a path to dialogue didn't mean letting go of accountability. Calling someone in doesn't mean excusing the harm. It means believing that growth is possible if they're willing to do the work. In didnt, classrooms, corporate workshops, and leadership forums, their exchange is now a reference point. Not just for what was said, but for how it was handled. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett modeled something powerful. She didn't just defend herself. She didn't just dismantle a harmful narrative. She offered something even more radical, an invitation to understand, and that, in an era defined by division, was nothing short of transformative. In the halls of Congress, confrontation is nothing new. But what happened between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another partisan clash, it became a defining moment, a moment where dignity triumphed over insult, where evidence overpowered insinuation, where leadership meant not just speaking truth, but inviting change. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an exchange. She redefined what political courage looks like in our time, and the public took notice. From cable news to community centers, from policy circles to classroom discussions, the phrase, "pull a Crockett," now lives on as a symbol of facing hostility, not with hate, but with facts, poise, and the willingness to lead with purpose. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in the face of disrespect is rise higher. If this story moved you, share it. Let others see what real leadership looks like. Hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dive breakdowns of pivotal political moments, and drop a comment below. What's the political confrontation you think the world needs to hear next? Let's keep the conversation honest, informed, and, most of all, human.